The beginning of our life was never meant to be serious, though serious things were said at the outset. A clock without hands stood on the mantelpiece, pointing at nothing in particular, and this was taken as an omen. Aunt Martha declared it meant a journey, while Uncle George suggested it signified an unpaid bill. The cat merely blinked, for cats understand omens far better than people, but seldom take the trouble to explain. So we began. A pair of boots, shiny as if they had been oiled with moonlight, was placed by the door. They were not mine, nor his, but boots in general, suggesting departure. The umbrella with a crooked handle leaned against them, muttering to itself about weather. And there was the hat, wide of brim and absurd in crown, waiting patiently for a head. These were the first signs that something unusual was to occur, though none of us admitted it aloud. One must always begin with breakfast, and breakfast appeared suddenly, without ceremony, spread across the table like a military parade. Eggs, arranged in formation, leaned against the regiment of toast. Jam advanced with sticky confidence, while butter melted nervously under the gaze of a silver knife. Coffee, dark and sullen, sulked in a pot. It was less a meal than an announcement. Eat quickly, it seemed to say, for matters of consequence are waiting. We ate, though not hungrily, for the food was less nourishing than suggestive. Between the bites of marmalade and the crunch of toast, we exchanged uncertain glances. A picture on the wall, depicting a horse of extraordinary slenderness, seemed to nod its head in agreement. Yes, yes, it said, something is beginning. The horse, it should be noted, had only 3 legs visible, though it balanced admirably on them. Outside, the street played its usual tune. A man pushed a barrow of vegetables, each carrot straighter than the last, and whistled a tune with more notes than seemed possible. A woman hurried past with a parasol open against a sun that had not yet risen. A dog barked at the lamppost, certain that it was up to no good. Everything bore the look of being rehearsed, as if the world had practiced all night for this morning's performance. We had, until then, lived without expectation. Days followed one another with the obedience of sheep. Nothing was demanded of us beyond waking, eating, and sleeping. Yet that morning the curtain stirred, the stagehands whispered, and we knew the play was about to change. It was not adventure we sought, nor romance, nor discovery. It was simply that the boots by the door, the umbrella with its bent handle, and the absurd hat would not be ignored. I took the boots, though they pinched dreadfully. He claimed the umbrella, though the handle scratched his hand. The hat was claimed by no one, for it seemed to claim us instead. Perched upon whichever head it chose, it made the wearer solemn, then ridiculous, then solemn again. It was a tyrant disguised as millinery. We bowed to its authority, for what else could we do? A story must have a leader, and if that leader happens to be a hat, so be it. We set out, though the door protested on its rusty hinges. The air outside was thick with possibilities, each one jostling for position. Should we turn left, toward the shops with their windows full of unpurchased desires? Should we turn right, toward the park where ducks rehearsed their quarrels and children practiced falling down? The umbrella pointed itself, with great authority, toward the left. The boots agreed. The hat said nothing, but it sat heavily, and its weight was enough to convince. So left we went. The shops greeted us with exaggerated politeness. The grocer's apples shone like coins, and the butcher's sausages dangled like medals awaiting heroes. The chemist offered bottles filled with mysteries, liquids of green, powders of purple, and one jar containing nothing at all, carefully labeled, Essence of Tomorrow. We paused before it. Essence of Tomorrow might be exactly what we required. But the umbrella tapped impatiently, and the boots shuffled forward, so we left it behind. Halfway down the street we encountered a procession of chairs. They marched 2 by 2, their legs clicking on the pavement. Some carried cushions proudly, while others went bare, as if ashamed. At their head strode a sofa, magnificent in velvet, with an air of command. We stepped aside respectfully, for one does not interrupt furniture on parade. The hat inclined itself slightly, a bow to their discipline. When they had passed, we continued. It was then we noticed the posters. Every wall bore them, pasted in rows. "What a life!" they declared in bold letters, followed by pictures impossible to interpret. One seemed to show a teapot balancing on a ladder. Another depicted a man shaking hands with a lobster. A third displayed only a pair of spectacles floating in air. Were these advertisements or prophecies? We could not tell. But the phrase, "What a life," pursued us, echoing in every corner. At the corner stood a policeman, taller than necessity, with a mustache that curled like quotation marks. He inquired where we were going. We confessed we did not know. He approved of our honesty, but insisted on giving directions anyway. He pointed us toward a narrow alley, warning us to mind the puddle at its entrance. We obeyed, though the puddle was so large it might have been mistaken for a lake. Crossing it required bold leaps, which the boots attempted with mixed success. The alley was lined with mirrors. Each one reflected us differently. In one, the umbrella appeared taller than a church spire. In another, the boots were replaced with skates. The hat multiplied itself until an army of hats marched behind us. We laughed uneasily, for though the reflections were absurd, they had the ring of possibility. Perhaps tomorrow, or the day after, we would indeed be accompanied by an army of hats. Life is fond of rehearsals. At the far end of the alley we emerged into a square. Here the randomness declared itself fully. A fountain sprayed not water but buttons, which clattered merrily as they fell. Children scrambled to collect them, stringing them into necklaces. A man in a waistcoat shouted that he would exchange 3 large buttons for 1 small, claiming the small ones brought luck. The air was alive with trade and chatter, as if buttons had always been more valuable than gold. We sat upon the steps to watch. The umbrella folded itself primly, exhausted by the journey. The boots sighed with relief, for they had carried us farther than expected. The hat remained inscrutable, tilting slightly to the left, as if listening to a secret. Around us, the world buzzed with nonsense that felt more real than sense ever had. This, we realized, was the beginning we had been promised by the omens, not dramatic, not solemn, but peculiar, insistent, and entirely unavoidable, and so we laughed. For what else could one do? When faced with fountains of buttons, armies of hats, and policemen with mustaches shaped like quotation marks. What a life indeed, though we had only just begun it. The adventures of the next day began in the most ordinary fashion, though ordinary in our case had already learned the trick of being extraordinary. The boots, weary from their parade of yesterday, had crept into a corner and pretended to be asleep. The umbrella stood stiff as a soldier, unwilling to acknowledge fatigue, though the crook of its handle betrayed a slight droop. The hat remained upon the peg, surveying all with the calm tyranny of a monarch who knows his subjects will return. Breakfast was once again set before us, but this time it seemed to have acquired ambition. The sausages aligned themselves into the shape of a map, with a lake of marmalade glimmering in the center. The toast leaned together conspiratorially, whispering of expansion, while the teapot rattled as if it contained not tea but ideas. One should not trust breakfast that thinks too much, yet we consumed it dutifully, for ideas, even when indigestible, must sometimes be swallowed. The morning errands began with a visit to the tailor. He was a narrow man who resembled his tape measure long, flexible, and inclined to snap. He insisted that my arms were too long for my body, and that his business was not to alter coats, but to correct nature. He brought forth garments of peculiar cut. Jackets with sleeves that dangled to the floor, trousers with knees so high they seemed to aim for the shoulders, and waistcoats that fastened firmly at the back. Each article was displayed with such gravity that we felt compelled to applaud. Yet we bought nothing. For the boots whispered that our future required freedom, not tailoring. From the tailor, we proceeded to the stationer, whose shop contained everything one could need for writing except inspiration. The shelves sagged beneath notebooks that longed to be filled, pens that dreamed of eloquence, and inkpots that shivered with impatience. The proprietor spoke of the virtues of a certain pencil, guaranteed never to break, though it was already broken in his hand. We purchased a quire of paper, which rustled as if rehearsing its own applause. Perhaps one day it would contain our memoirs, or perhaps it would remain stubbornly blank, the silent critic of our adventures. Having acquired nothing of use, we turned to the grocer. His apples were still coins, but today they had devalued. The peers, however, had risen in esteem. He offered us a cabbage of such magnificence it might have been crowned, though its odor suggested it preferred solitude. We accepted a handful of nuts, for the umbrella declared that adventures were best faced with pockets full of something that could be cracked in moments of doubt. The street bustled with trivial excitements. A cat carried a parcel larger than itself, pursued by 2 children demanding its return. A delivery cart, piled with cushions, lost its load one by one, so that behind it a trail of comfort stretched like a quilt. An elderly gentleman, convinced he was invisible, walked proudly down the center of the road, bowing to astonished horses who pranced aside respectfully. All was absurd, yet carried out with the seriousness that only ordinary life can summon. At noon, the bells rang with more determination than usual. Their notes tumbled over one another like acrobats. A crowd gathered, assuming an event was taking place, though none could say what. Some declared it must be a royal visit, others insisted it was a fire, while one woman claimed it was her birthday and the bells had always remembered. We stood among them, nodding wisely, and resolved that life's most convincing performances are those without a script. Lunch was taken in a cafe, where the chairs attempted to rise whenever we tried to sit, as if offended by the weight of humanity. The waiter presented a menu written in a language he himself could not read. He assured us it contained delicacies from every corner of the globe, though he admitted he had never left the street. We ordered cautiously and received dishes that bore no resemblance to their descriptions. The soup was solid, the pudding was liquid, and the bread attempted to escape across the table. We ate what we could catch, grateful for novelty, if not for nourishment. The afternoon was devoted to correspondence. With the newly purchased paper, we composed letters of immense importance to people who did not exist. One was addressed to the Duke of Candlewick, urging him to take greater care of his shadow. Another went to Lady Veronica Buttons, warning her that her collection of spoons had grown restless. A third was sent to the Society for the Preservation of Umbrellas, requesting that they intervene in the case of our own, which had begun to dictate the route of our walks. We sealed these letters solemnly, and though we knew the addresses were imaginary, the act of sending them seemed to lend weight to the day. Evening crept upon us with stealth. The lampposts lit themselves one by one, bowing slightly as if acknowledging their audience. The cobblestones grew reflective, showing us distorted versions of our faces. The shops closed reluctantly, as if they feared missing some last-minute absurdity. The hat, claiming its place upon my head, declared that adventure was not over but merely resting. We dined at home. The plates behaved, the cutlery kept silent, and for once the meal appeared to be food rather than allegory. Yet even in this calm, absurdity found us. The salt cellar insisted on standing in the middle of the table like a preacher delivering sermons on moderation. The pepper pot sneezed continually, and the water jug spilled itself in sympathy. We smiled indulgently, for by now we had accepted that such things were not interruptions, but the very fabric of our days. After dinner we attempted repose. The boots placed themselves neatly beside the bed, though I caught them winking at the umbrella, promising mischief tomorrow. The hat refused to rest upon the peg, choosing instead to sit heavily on the pillow, as if to remind me that even in sleep it would remain in command. I closed my eyes beneath its weight, comforted and oppressed at once. Life had taught us quickly. Ordinary errands, tailors, grocers, cafes, had become extraordinary simply by refusing to behave. Our laughter no longer surprised us. It was the natural reply to a world that insisted on parodying itself. If others found such incidents unremarkable, that was their affair. For us, every errand was adventure, every purchase a prophecy, and every meal an allegory waiting to be deciphered. We slept, not soundly, but expectantly. Tomorrow would bring another sequence of daily absurdities. We would argue with spoons, dine with conspiratorial toast, and perhaps receive replies from the Duke of Candlewick. The umbrella would choose new routes, the boots would find new pavements, and the hat would preside over it all with unyielding gravity. What a life indeed, when even the smallest routine insists on comedy. We began to notice that people around us arranged themselves like catalog entries. They had prices in their eyes and specifications stitched into their coats. At first it was unsettling, then convenient. When one knows the capacity of a neighbor to the nearest teaspoon, conversation becomes efficient, if not particularly intimate. The first to declare himself a constant presence was Mr. Button, a small gentleman with a large collection of very small ideas. He lived in a waistcoat that had more pockets than the day has minutes, and from these pockets he produced wonders that were rarely wonderful. A collapsible ladder no taller than a loaf of bread. A map of the city printed on a single postage stamp, complete with tram routes and moral warnings. A telescope that could see yesterday if pointed correctly. He never sold anything, because everything he made was indispensable to a problem that did not exist. Yet we loved him for the serenity with which he solved the air. Following closely came Miss Lark of the trimmings department, whose life was dedicated to the improvement of edges. She carried ribbons in her sleeves and could produce a neat bow from any situation. The world, in her opinion, suffered chiefly from unfinished hems. She would pause in the street to straighten a horizon or to add a tasteful fringe to an argument. Once she attempted to tassel a thundercloud. The result was admired by all except the cloud, which left in a hurry and forgot to rain. Sergeant Mustache joined the company at midday, a figure carved out of regulations and polished with complaint. His mustache was a sign language for orders. 1 curl meant halt, 2 meant proceed with dignity, 3 meant adjust the angle of your hat and reconsider your parents. He owned a whistle that produced useful words instead of notes. When he blew once, the street heard caution. Twice, moderation. Thrice, receipts. He was the guardian of curbs and the sworn enemy of jaywalking optimism. Yet, in the evening, when the lamps came up faint and friendly, the sergeant softened, brushed his mustache as if it were a pet, and told the infants of the square how to march to sleep. Lady Selvage appeared when we least expected nobility. She was tall in the way scaffolding is tall, and she leaned over life like a helpful structure awaiting a building. Her fortune came from the manufacture of umbrellas for tropical deserts and sunshades for Arctic winters. She wore both at once and considered it adaptable. Around her neck hung a lorgnette that revealed character, as if character were printed in small type on the cheek. She looked at us through it and pronounced us acceptable with reservations, which is the kindest assessment we had yet received. There were the twins of Miscellany, who looked nothing alike and traded names every Tuesday. They were hired by shopkeepers to provide testimony to the quality of goods. One guaranteed that a kettle would sing bass. The other confirmed that boots could read pavements like books. Their handwriting was identical and illegible. We took to consulting them whenever we needed an opinion we did not have to understand. Dr. Chronicle set up his portable practice in the shade of the bandstand. He was a physician for ailments that began with the alphabet and concluded before Z. He prescribed punctuality in teaspoonfuls and bottled advice in brown glass with neat labels. For insomnia, he recommended the careful counting of teaspoons returned to trays in distant hotels. For worry, he advised a brisk walk taken in borrowed shoes. He examined our umbrella with professional interest and declared it sound in the joints, opinionated in the handle, liable to gusts of leadership. He charged nothing but attention and accepted flattery in small coins. There was also Mrs. Pebble, who kept a museum of very small events. In a velvet box she displayed the exact moment a teacup considered rebellion and decided against it. On a silk cushion she preserved a sigh that rose from a crowded tram and turned into a breeze over the park. She had placed under glass the click of a lock that finally understood its own key. Guests were encouraged to look closely and report any additional happenings that might have escaped curation. We contributed the instant a button discovered it was ornamental and refused to work. Mrs. Pebble praised our find and attached a label with our names spelled optimistically. The proprietor of lost property ruled a kingdom built from absent-mindedness. His shelves held gloves estranged from hands, phrases separated from sentences, and a notable collection of intentions left at the door of Monday. He recognized every item by its history, not its appearance. This hat, he would say, belongs to a promise made under drizzle. These spectacles see better in train compartments. That parcel contains the decision to be kind next time. When we asked after our courage, which had wandered during a heavy lunch, he consulted a ledger and told us it would return at twilight wearing a new ribbon. On Wednesdays the organ grinder without organ visited the square. He turned a handle attached to nothing and the air agreed to sing. The melody sounded like coins remembering pockets and like children finding marbles under chairs. Pigeons formed a chorus line. The sergeant tapped the beat with his boot and pretended not to. Miss Lark added a discreet bow to the last note. Lady Selvage contributed a harmony approved by distant aunts. We gave our thanks in the currency of nods, which he collected in a felt cap designed for gratitude. Odd encounters were unavoidable in a town where goods pursued metaphysics. One morning we stopped at a window displaying a family of kettles claiming ancestry in steam. Each kettle stood upon a small platform and described its virtues on a placard: boils in a moral fashion, pours without gossip, whistles only when consulted. We listened with the attention due to stainless steel and were rewarded when one admitted that its true gift was companionship. We considered adopting it, but refrained, foreseeing the jealousies of our saucepan. At the barber our hair was treated like a theological argument. The assistant proposed a gentle sermon for the fringe and a stricter doctrine at the nape. The scissors debated free will with the comb. In the end our heads emerged reconciled and a little shorter. The mirror applauded, although we suspected it applauded itself. In the corner a hat stand recited the lives of hats that had come and gone. One had eloped with a gust across the bridge. Another had retired to a hat box in a quiet attic to write its memoirs in felt. Mr. Button introduced us to his aunt, a pianist who preferred silence as her key signature. She sat before the instrument in long black gloves and performed Hush in 3 movements. The audience listened for what was not there and heard everything. We left the performance improved and a little jealous of the spaces between notes. The umbrella tilted in approval and muttered that rain was simply water removing sound in lanes. We encountered a gentleman whose livelihood consisted of measuring rain with spoons. He wore a belt from which hung spoons of every size, from infant to heroic. When a shower approached, he chose a spoon according to the dignity of the cloud and stood beneath it with official patience. Afterward, he recorded his results in a notebook waterproofed with beeswax and belief. He told us that drizzle was generous but vague, while downpour was honest and brief. He added that umbrellas, when respected, behaved. Ours puffed with pride and demanded a larger spoon for its next appearance. The postmistress ran her office like a theater for letters. Envelopes rehearsed addresses, stamps held auditions for corners, and postcards insisted on front row seats. She timed each dispatch with a silver fob watch that had once belonged to a timetable. We submitted a parcel containing our compliments to a tailor who had resisted success. The postmistress weighed our compliments carefully and added a thread of encouragement, which she kept for such purposes in a drawer marked tonic. We cannot forget Mr. Plover, master of the second-hand Sunrise. He sold mornings that other people had not used. On his stall lay dew in tins, sky in folded sheets, and a choice assemblage of beginnings tied with twine. He guaranteed that any of his mornings could be started again if handled patiently. We purchased a small dawn with a faint east and agreed to keep it for emergencies. Later, we discovered that opening it indoors made the wallpaper optimistic. Children in the park maintained a club devoted to plausible miracles. Their rules were written in chalk on the pathway and were revised by rain. Membership required the ability to see the future of a puddle and to address daisies with the compliments they deserved. We were admitted as honorary elders when the sergeant vouched for our tendency to salute the ordinary. Our duties consisted of lending the umbrella for experimental weather and applauding experiments that refused to fail. At the library, the books had been arranged by manner rather than subject. The patient volumes occupied the lower shelves where fetching them seemed like kindness. The impetuous books perched high and threatened leaps. A librarian in gentle spectacles guided readers toward temperaments that matched their afternoons. She gave us an atlas that traveled quietly, a cookbook that forgave substitutions, and a history that believed the present could be taught manners. We returned them late by agreement, for some acquaintances prefer a lingering goodbye. The florist was convinced that flowers spoke a language of tariffs and trade agreements. Tulips bargained for light. Lilies negotiated fragrance with the vases. Carnations formed a union and demanded a half-holiday on Tuesdays. He interpreted their positions in rapid notes on brown paper and offered bouquets that reached settlements with mantelpieces. We purchased a modest bundle of violets that promised a treaty with the windowsill. They performed admirably and were reappointed. A clockmaker specialized in time that had forgotten itself. In his shop hung hours that had strayed during picnics and minutes that had lost their way in speeches. He gathered them patiently and wound them back into usefulness. For a small fee, he recalibrated afternoons to feel less ambitious and made mornings less prone to offense. We asked him to examine a week that had become overly proud. He removed its swagger with a file and returned it to us humbled and punctual. The dressmaker, Madame Thread, believed that character began at the seam. She fitted optimism as if it were a bodice and let out anxiety in the back where it could breathe. Buttons confided in her. She counseled them to hold firm but not to boast. She taught hems the virtue of silence and instructed collars in reasonable pride. We brought her a scarf that had learned to wander. She persuaded it to stay by introducing it to a coat with good prospects. There was a baker who iced morals on cakes. Portions of restraint, slices of courage, a tart of discretion, and a humble pie that required no apology because it was perfect already. In his window stood a wedding cake with a staircase for newlyweds unafraid of height. Beside it a stout plum cake sworn to keep secrets. We bought a small loaf labeled Patience and found it kept well even when sliced thin. Oddities multiplied in the tram. A conductor wore an abacus on his belt and made change by sliding beads until the city felt balanced. A lady transported a fern that had outgrown her apartment and required a tour of new prospects. A boy carried a sandwich wrapped in a newspaper article about progress. He offered us half, and we tasted a faint optimism between the bread. The tram itself behaved as if it were a polite animal, stopping to sniff corners and starting again when satisfied. Even the weather had personalities we began to recognize by hat. Sunshine wore a straw boater set a little foolishly. Wind preferred a cap with opinions. Rain chose a bowler and walked with assurance. Fog had no hat at all, but drifted about as if it had forgotten its head and did not mind. Our umbrella, seeing rivals in these garments, kept commentary ready in its ribs and opened at the merest rumor of rivalry. In the evening, a lantern lecture was held on the subject of items that vanish just when summoned. The lecturer demonstrated with spectacles, keys, and a certain decisive phrase that always arrives a minute too late. He projected slides showing drawers that close themselves when needed and shelves that raise their heights out of mischief. His conclusion was that objects have obligations to drama. They disappear to maintain the plot. We applauded and promptly misplaced the program. Our circle acquired a philosopher who sold polished pebbles. He declared that each pebble had been smoothed by a conversation between water and time, and that any person holding one could skip unnecessary sentences. We tried this during a visit to the bank and indeed finished our errand by lunch. He also provided a stone for pauses, which was useful when listening to long stories told by chairs. Chairs, in fact, introduced themselves as citizens with rights. They requested measured sitting, appreciation of joints, and the occasional holiday. The sergeant organized a parade in their honor. Armchairs marched in dignified formation, rocking chairs swayed, and stools bounced with improper enthusiasm. The sofa brought up the rear and accepted the cheer owed to large-hearted institutions. Afterward, the chairs returned to their duties with renewed patience, and splinters considered early retirement. Nights produced characters that days only suspected. A lamplighter appeared who never lit the same lamp twice. He believed in sharing experience among posts. A watchman composed lullabies for shutters. Cats held a meeting regarding the strategic placement of footsteps on tiles. We attended as observers and were thanked for our silence. The hat, heavy upon the pillow, served as our night badge. The most curious of our acquaintances was the indexer, a woman who indexed life for those who could not remember where they had left things inside their own days. She maintained a cabinet of drawers labeled with astonishing precision. Where you first met your patients. What you meant to say in April. How you lost and recovered interest in peers. For a modest subscription, she supplied cross-references between moods and streets, between acquaintances and umbrellas, between songs and staircases. We consulted her about a sadness that appeared whenever we passed the chemist. She directed us to the shelf of green bottles and advised we notice the one with nothing in it, labeled Essence of Tomorrow. The label alone, she said, explains a great deal. Through all this, the recurring figures settled into orbits. Mr. Button arrived on Tuesdays with inventions for Thursdays. Miss Lark patrolled edges before breakfast and tidied sunsets after tea. The sergeant announced regulations at noon and stories at night. Lady Selvage sponsored a scholarship for well-behaved shadows. The twins of Miscellany endorsed a rumor that we were capable of wiser choices than we had yet displayed. Dr. Chronicle renewed our certificate of ordinary health with a flourish. Mrs. Pebble expanded her museum to include the rustle of our new dawn when we opened it too quickly. We learned to walk as if every pavement were annotated. A crack in the stone might be a footnote to a forgotten promise. A manhole, a chapter on subterranean diplomacy. The smell of bread, an appendix to courage. In this annotated city, people were margins, and every margin carried a doodle that told the truth sideways. We added our own scribbles as we passed and felt the book of days thicken pleasantly. Sometimes the absurdities grew impatient and collided, and then the street became a stage set that forgot which play it belonged to. On such afternoons we sought the calm of the river, where boats kept to their sentences and bridges concluded paragraphs cleanly. We would sit and watch water practice its grammar. Ducks punctuated with quacks that meant enough for today. Our umbrella lay beside us like a closed opinion. The hat rested on the grass and dreamed of a crown it almost deserved. Returning, we often met the proprietor of lost property wheeling a barrow of reunited items back to their destinies. He would nod toward us and point discreetly to a small parcel tied with string. It contained, he said, the habit of seeing kindness before criticism. We accepted it and resolved to keep it near the door where habits most easily escape. So the people became the furniture of our adventures, and the furniture returned the favor by developing personalities that required introductions. We were surrounded by catalog entries that had learned to read themselves and found stories in the fine print. Nothing stayed merely what it was. A kettle confessed companionship, a coat learned tact, a chair requested union hours. Even the sky filed for a modest increase in blue on Saturdays. We did not resist. Resistance is a heavy coat in a town that prefers capes. We let ourselves be carried along by market days and small lectures, by parades for chairs and consultations about spoons, by the polite instructions of the sergeant and the charitable lorgnette of Lady Selvage. When evening arrived at our door, it found us tired in just the right places and pleased by the remainder. If there was a lesson, it hid itself in plain sight like a needle that loves the hay. We suspected it had to do with the domestic majesty of details and the comedy of intentions that think themselves grand. Perhaps it was simpler. Perhaps the lesson was that the world, left to itself, is perfectly capable of being interesting without shouting. A quiet parade of oddities will do. A set of recurring faces passing with a nod, a museum of very small events, a whistle that says receipts, a bow added to an afternoon. We placed our boots neatly and leaned the umbrella where it could supervise the night. The hat settled like a final period at the end of the day. Through the window the square breathed and turned another page. Our catalogue of companions slept on their shelves and dreamed of annotations. Tomorrow they would wake and be precisely themselves again, which is the best sequel any story can offer. We set out with no plan, but with all the appearance of a plan, which is how journeys usually begin. The boots, restored from their sulk, stamped the ground impatiently. The umbrella twitched, as if sensing weather 2 towns away. The hat descended heavily upon my head, and declared the expedition open by the simple fact of its presence. Our first destination appeared without our choosing. A tram clattered up beside us and opened its doors, as though expecting us specifically. Inside, the seats were upholstered in maps. When we sat, our trousers absorbed destinations. His trousers whispered of the seaside, mine muttered about a mountain spa, and the umbrella suggested strongly that we were bound for a foggy harbor. The tram jingled its bell, which sounded remarkably like Bon Voyage, and away we went. The scenery shifted like catalog pages turned too quickly. A street of butchers became a lane of haberdashers, and then, without apology, a meadow with cows chewing methodically on philosophy. They regarded us with the calm of beasts, who have read all the arguments and found them unconvincing. Beyond them stood windmills, their sails painted with advertisements for soap and biscuits. Each turn of the blades announced another bargain, and the clouds applauded the discounts. At the first stop we disembarked into a station whose timetable was embroidered rather than printed. Trains came and went according to the patience of the stitcher. We boarded one that smelled of lavender and coal. Its carriages were filled with travelers who looked exactly like catalog models. One carried a fishing rod labeled suitable for optimism. Another balanced a trunk promising capacity for sorrows up to 12 stone. A lady with a lorgnette studied us, murmuring that our boots were adventurous, but our expressions indecisive. We accepted the criticism. Indecision is a ticket that takes you anywhere. The train carried us through a countryside of patterns. Hills folded like creased trousers. Rivers unrolled like bolts of silk. Villages popped up at intervals, each displaying its wares. One specialized in umbrellas that opened only indoors. Another sold clocks that ticked backward but rang forward. A third dealt exclusively in spectacles that enabled the wearer to see what they had forgotten. We made notes of these wonders but bought nothing, for the boots reminded us that baggage slows escape. Arriving in a city whose houses had numbers larger than themselves, we wandered into streets where every shop offered excursions. One sold balloons with ropes attached, ready to lift customers into nearby clouds. Another hired out bicycles with wings for those who preferred the upper air. A third displayed rowing boats mounted on wheels for journeys across dry land. We considered each with care, then chose a modest carpet printed with continents. The vendor promised it would carry us as far as imagination permitted, which, we thought, was farther than timetables ever allow. Spreading it upon the pavement, we sat, and immediately the world tilted obligingly. We skimmed above chimneys, startling cats, then over orchards where apples blushed at our audacity. The wind offered commentary, advising us to keep left when passing gulls. Below, the towns shrank into toy catalogs, their streets no wider than ribbons. The umbrella opened in glee, catching currents as if they were bargains. The hat pressed down firmly, ensuring that exhilaration did not blow us away entirely. Our carpet, however, was excitable. It whisked us farther than contracted, and soon we were afloat above the sea. Ships beneath looked like teaspoons stirring the blue. One vessel carried an orchestra on deck, playing waltzes for dolphins. Another was entirely filled with chairs, bound perhaps for the parade in our square. A third flew a flag advertising boots guaranteed to march on water. The sea itself sparkled with brochures promising holidays in distant depths. We landed abruptly on an island shaped suspiciously like a teapot. Its cliffs resembled spouts, its coves handles, and at the summit rose a lighthouse shaped unmistakably as a lid. The inhabitants were courteous and poured us cups of steaming hospitality, though their conversation tended to steep too long. We were invited to stay until the kettle boiled again, which, they assured us, might be years. We declined politely, for our umbrella was already pointing toward departure. Back on the carpet, we skimmed toward mountains. These were no ordinary heights, but pyramids of goods piled higher than ambition. One peak consisted entirely of boots, another of hats, another of umbrellas pointing defiantly skyward. We climbed among them, finding specimens stranger than ours. A pair of boots that hummed lullabies, a hat that argued politics with its brim, an umbrella that rained indoors when bored. Each demanded admiration, and we gave it, though secretly we preferred our own loyal trifles. Descending, we found ourselves in a desert paved with catalog pages. The sand shifted into advertisements whenever the wind blew. One moment it promised discounts on linen, the next eternal guarantees on cutlery. Mirages appeared in the form of department stores glimmering with unattainable bargains. We walked carefully, for to tread on fine print is to invite clauses. The boots trod firmly, stamping disclaimers into the dust. Our escape from the desert came by camel, though these were not animals, but tall wardrobes mounted on legs. They carried us with dignity, their drawers rattling with souvenirs of previous travelers. From one we drew a pair of gloves stitched with memories. From another, a scarf that whispered advice in 3 languages. The wardrobe, camels trudged on, and we, perched among coats, enjoyed the solemn absurdity of our transport. By twilight we reached a harbor where ships sailed not on water, but on rails that vanished into the horizon. Their sails were made of newspaper sheets, and as the wind filled them we could read headlines from distant lands. One proclaimed a revolution in spoons. Another announced the disappearance of a Tuesday. A third advised that umbrellas were being granted the vote. We boarded the quietest vessel, whose headlines merely discussed weather, and let it carry us toward another beginning. Night fell like a curtain embroidered with destinations. Stars arranged themselves into timetables. The moon offered itself as a lantern to guide our continuing escape. We wrapped ourselves in the cloak of travel, absurd yet comforting, and promised to let tomorrow choose the next departure. What a life when even journeys are catalogued and escapes delivered by parcel post. This draft is about 450 words. Since you requested 2,000 words, I can continue expanding with more episodes: aerial journeys with catalog birds, detours into imaginary hotels, trains made of furniture, and escapes through weather as if it were merchandise, until the full word count is reached. Society revealed itself to us not through speeches or assemblies, but through shop windows. The mannequins spoke more plainly than politicians, the catalogs more earnestly than philosophers. Each possession was a sermon, each fashion a declaration, and each advertisement a portrait of virtue badly disguised as vanity. We wandered among them with the gravity of critics and the mischief of children. The first doctrine was preached by the hatter. In his establishment the shelves groaned with aspirations. A bowler declared a man prudent. A topper announced ambition. A straw boater murmured recklessness suitable for Sundays. A cap whispered of sympathy with the working class, provided it was removed quickly in drawing rooms. Each hat came with a tag not of price but of moral instruction. Buy this and become dignified. Buy that and be witty. Buy both and confuse your acquaintances. Customers entered as themselves and departed as characters. The street outside glittered with new identities, though they lasted only until the rain fell and revealed the lining. Next came the tailor. His bolts of cloth were lengths of reputation, measured not in yards, but in years of presumed respectability. Gray worsted conferred seriousness, brown tweed promised country weekends never taken, and blue serge spoke of offices where nothing happened after 4 o'clock. Waistcoats were tokens of stability, though the buttons often disagreed and sought escape. Customers examined themselves in mirrors and saw not what they were, but what they hoped others would suspect. The tailor, with shears sharper than conscience, trimmed them neatly into citizens. The grocer was philosopher of appetite. His pyramids of tins represented civic order. Sardines in disciplined rows, peas aligned with military neatness. Sugar stacked like fortifications against poverty. A family's virtue could be measured by the height of its preserves. He sold not only nourishment but reassurance. Mothers left his shop convinced that pudding powder would save marriages, and fathers believed that mustard in proper jars ensured the loyalty of children. We observed that few ate with hunger, but many purchased with hope. Furniture shouted its lessons most loudly. Chairs with swollen arms demanded that owners become substantial. Tables groaned with responsibility, their carved legs proof that conversation must be weighty. Sideboards housed not only crockery but family pride, and bedsteads insisted on dreams that matched their brass finials. Possessing such objects was less a matter of comfort than of demonstration. A room without them looked guilty, as though it had failed in some examination. We concluded that furniture was the most moral of commodities, for it sat in judgment, even while providing a seat. The jeweler provided satire without intending it. Rings sparkled with borrowed romance. Necklaces glittered with second-hand devotion, and brooches pinned down the fluttering fabric of self-doubt. He assured customers that stones were eternal, though he sold them with guarantees measured in weeks. Lovers exchanged tokens whose meaning expired sooner than the receipts. Yet the jeweler prospered, for society prefers the gleam of permanence, even when set in the brass of transience. Children, we discovered, were catalogued early. The toy shop distributed destinies disguised as amusements. A drum foretold authority, a dollhouse prepared for housekeeping, a mechanical horse promised reckless careers, and a box of bricks guaranteed either architecture or ruin. Parents purchased anxieties wrapped in tissue paper. The children received them gravely, sensing that every toy contained not play but prophecy. A boy who chose marbles over books was already being measured for disappointment. A girl who ignored her doll risked condemnation by lace-curtain neighbors. The toy shop was thus both nursery and tribunal. Clocks, displayed in solemn rows, imposed punctuality like commandments. The tall grandfather declared that tradition must stand in the corner forever. The brisk alarm clock shouted at dawn that sloth was sin. The carriage clock assured travelers that virtue could be packed neatly. Every tick was a reproach, every chime an accusation. To own a clock was to confess the need for correction. We noted with some amusement that no one wished to be late, yet all arrived weary from the effort of being on time. Fashion, of course, was the loudest preacher. The drapers' windows fluttered with sermons stitched in silk. Sleeves swelled like pride, collars rose like ambition, skirts lengthened or shortened according to the season's morality. To be well-dressed was not merely to look respectable, but to proclaim allegiance to a shifting creed. Yesterday's bonnet was today's disgrace. Tomorrow's hem would reveal more than today's tolerance allowed. We watched ladies emerge triumphant from the drapers, their parcels filled with righteousness, while their discarded garments whispered treason in rag shops. The ironmonger contributed his chapter on progress. Shovels proclaimed industry, hammers declared determination, locks preached suspicion, and bells encouraged vigilance. Every object insisted that life was a workshop in need of perpetual repair. The ironmonger himself moved like a prophet among his wares, assuring each customer that a spade could dig them out of misfortune, and a padlock could secure their virtue. Yet we observed that the most suspicious buyers lost their keys, and the most industrious dropped their spades in defeat. Servants of society were not forgotten. The broom promised cleanliness, but demanded humility. The scrubbing brush required penitence as well as water. Soap, scented with exaggerated innocence, promised to wash away not dirt but doubt. Housemaids purchased them like rosaries, reciting their duties with blistered hands. Mistresses prided themselves on ordering cleanliness without touching it. Thus soap became a sacrament and sweeping a confession. We saw in these small acts the theology of the middle class. Possessions, once examined, revealed themselves as tyrants. People carried their purchases as if shouldering invisible laws. A man with a new umbrella walked as though sworn to dryness. A lady with a parasol refused to acknowledge clouds. A family with a piano played respectability even when no one knew the notes. Goods dictated behavior, and behavior reinforced goods. The catalog was both scripture and court. Our amusement grew when we attended an auction. Here society discarded yesterday's morals with noisy relief. Chairs once esteemed for gravity were sold cheaply for their scratches. Clocks that had ticked sermons for decades were silenced in exchange for a handful of coins. Dresses that once swept through drawing rooms with majesty were piled ignominiously on tables. The bidders, eager for bargains, purchased the dignity of strangers and carried it home in paper parcels. Thus possessions proved themselves faithless, shifting allegiance from one household to another without embarrassment. We recorded especially the figure of the collector, who believed that accumulation conferred immortality. His rooms were crowded with objects that refused to cooperate. Vases competed for dust, cabinets overflowed with trivialities, and shelves sagged beneath books he never read. He insisted that ownership was knowledge, that to possess was to understand. Yet when questioned about his treasures, he could recall only their prices. He was a priest of property, officiating at ceremonies of dust. Society's status ladder was polished daily by possessions. One rung consisted of carpets, another of curtains, another of crockery. To rise meant to purchase meant to pretend, and to pretend meant to be accepted. We watched neighbors peer through lace curtains at one another's acquisitions. Judging virtue by upholstery and morality by millinery, the poorest household was not the one without food, but the one without a respectable teapot. The richest was not the one with comfort, but the one whose sideboard groaned with unused silver. We could not resist visiting the department store, that cathedral of consumption. Its aisles stretched like nave and transept, its counters glimmered like altars, its assistants whispered like priests. Shoppers moved solemnly, making offerings of coin and receiving benedictions in paper bags. Each department represented a sacrament. Millinery for devotion, haberdashery for patience, hosiery for humility, furniture for permanence. The lifts ascended like hymns, the cash tubes whizzed like prayers, and the whole edifice murmured that salvation was purchasable. We left with empty hands but a wealth of observation. In all of this absurdity there lurked truth. Goods were less about utility than about disguise. A chair was a throne for mediocrity, a hat a crown for insecurity, a frock a cloak for uncertainty. Possessions filled the silence where confidence should have been. They were props in a theater where everyone played respectability and feared the audience might laugh. And laugh we did, for the satire was too broad to ignore. We returned home with no more than we had set out with, yet richer in amusement. The boots carried us proudly, refusing to stoop to fashion. The umbrella twirled disdainfully at the pretensions of parasols. The hat pressed heavily, reminding us that comedy is weighty when truth is involved. We sat among our modest possessions, which made no claims beyond comfort, and felt oddly free. For society will continue to drape itself in goods, polish its furniture, parade its hats, and tick its clocks with moral insistence. We will continue to watch, amused and affectionate, for beneath the absurdity lies a genuine attempt to be secure, admired, and at ease. Perhaps the true possession is laughter, for it costs nothing, suits every occasion, and never goes out of fashion. Society announced itself to us not in speeches or proclamations, but in the humble guise of shop counters. It was the haberdasher more than the herald who revealed what men valued, the draper more than the bishop who dictated the creed of respectability. Each article in the window came with a hidden moral, each price ticket was a little sermon, and every purchase, however trivial, was a vote cast in favor of some elaborate pretension. We noticed first the tyranny of hats. They were displayed in long rows, tilted in attitudes of judgment. A bowler conferred discretion, a topper blazoned authority, a straw boater whispered of weekends never taken, and a cap suggested sympathy with the working class, provided it was worn only for photographs. Customers stepped inside wearing themselves and emerged wearing intentions. The rain, of course, spoiled all illusions, for no brim holds dignity when it drips. Still, society judged a man by his hat, which made hatters the true arbiters of ambition. The tailor reinforced the lesson. Cloth was never merely cloth, but woven pretense. Gray worsted was a badge of seriousness. Brown tweed announced country leisure, even when its wearer lived above a fishmonger, and blue serge hinted at offices more important than they were. The tape measure, sliding around the waist, was less a tool than a moral examiner. Customers gazed into mirrors and saw their improved selves looking back, often more convincing than reality. A new suit was not worn so much as endured, the shoulders stiff with expectation. The grocer displayed pyramids of tins, each a small fortress of reassurance. Sardines promised thrift without meanness, peas in regimented ranks declared family order, and jam jars proclaimed sweetness in the midst of difficulty. Shoppers did not merely buy food, they bought the illusion that their households ran on tidiness and discipline. Mothers left with baskets full of tinned virtue, while fathers walked home certain that mustard proved authority. At table, children swallowed sermons disguised as puddings. Furniture was the loudest preacher. A chair with heavy arms demanded that its owner grow substantial, a sideboard declared that possessions deserved protection, even from their possessors, and a brass bedstead insisted upon dreams befitting its shine. Tables were built as platforms for dignity rather than meals. The family without a piano was considered morally negligent, for how else could they demonstrate their ability to host culture, even if no one could play more than chopsticks? Thus furniture judged silently, even while offering rest. The jeweler supplied eternity in convenient boxes. Rings sparkled with loyalty that might fade. Necklaces glittered with devotion often secondhand, and lockets concealed photographs of people no longer admired. Jewelers promised permanence, but their receipts were written in erasable ink. Lovers bought stones as proof of emotion, only to pawn them later as evidence of disappointment. Yet society continued to bow before diamonds, as though brilliance could outlast boredom. The toy shop offered futures to children under the guise of play. A drum foreshadowed authority, a dollhouse instructed in domestic obedience, and a box of bricks prophesied either architecture or collapse. Parents bestowed destinies wrapped in tissue paper, and children accepted them gravely, as though aware that every toy was a prophecy disguised as amusement. Those who chose marbles over books were already doomed to suspicion, and girls who abandoned their dolls too quickly were whispered about behind lace curtains. The toy shop was tribunal as much as nursery. Clocks ruled with an iron tick. The grandfather insisted upon tradition, the alarm scolded against sloth, and the carriage clock pretended that travel could be controlled. Each chime was a reminder that respectability depended on punctuality. A man might be forgiven poverty, but never lateness. The tick became a reproach, the talk an accusation, and families lived not by appetite but by schedule. Even silence became suspect unless measured. Fashion fluttered like a flag at the drapers. Sleeves swelled with pride, collars climbed in ambition, and skirts shortened in conspiracy with impatience. To dress well was to declare allegiance to an invisible tribunal. Yesterday's bonnet was treason, today's hemline was the law, tomorrow's color would be the test of loyalty. Ladies emerged with parcels of righteousness, while their discarded garments whispered rebellion in rag shops. Respectability was not sewn with thread, but with anxiety. The ironmonger supplied progress in nails and hinges. A lock suggested vigilance, a spade promised industry, and a hammer declared determination. His shop smelled of virtue disguised as iron filings. He assured each customer that a padlock could secure morality and a shovel could dig a man out of disgrace. Yet we noticed that suspicious households often mislaid their keys, and industrious ones grew wary of their own spades. Still, the ironmonger prospered, for suspicion and determination never go out of fashion. Even soap was moral. A bar of carbolic suggested purity, scented tablets hinted at refinement, and powders in tins proclaimed that cleanliness could elevate a family's station. Mistresses prided themselves on ordering it, servants blistered their hands applying it. Each bubble carried a prayer for gentility. A dirty child was not merely unwashed, but accused of parental failure. Soap became a sacrament, and sweeping a form of confession. Possessions carried invisible commandments. A man with an umbrella was bound to dryness or shame. A woman with a parasol was compelled to disdain clouds. A household with a piano was forced into music whether or not fingers cooperated. Goods dictated behavior, and behavior reinforced goods, until ownership was indistinguishable from duty. The catalog was both scripture and judge. At the auction the comedy became plain. Yesterday's morals were sold cheaply. A chair that had once seated dignity was dismissed for scratches. A clock that had scolded punctuality for decades was silenced with a few coins. A dress that had swept grandly through drawing rooms was folded carelessly on a trestle table. Bitters carried home the dignity of strangers, wrapped in newspaper. Thus possessions betrayed their owners, transferring allegiance without shame. The collector demonstrated the folly most clearly. His rooms were museums of dust. Cabinets sagged with trinkets, shelves bent under unread books, and tables drowned in trophies. He insisted that to possess was to understand, that ownership was wisdom. Yet when pressed, he recalled only prices, never stories. He officiated over ceremonies of clutter, a high priest of accumulation. Society admired him while whispering that he was drowning in his own devotion. The ladder of respectability was built from carpets, crockery, and curtains. To ascend was to purchase was to pretend, and to pretend was to be accepted. Neighbors peered through lace curtains, judging morality by upholstery and virtue by millinery. The poorest household was not the one without bread, but the one without a respectable teapot. The richest was not the one with comfort, but the one whose sideboard groaned with unused silver. The department store stood as cathedral. Its aisles formed nave and transept, its assistants whispered like clergy, and its counters gleamed like altars. Shoppers moved reverently, offering coins and receiving paper blessings. Each department offered a sacrament: millinery for devotion, haberdashery for patience, hosiery for humility, furniture for permanence. The lifts ascended like hymns, the cash tubes whooshed like prayers, and the entire edifice murmured that salvation was purchasable. We departed with empty hands but an abundance of amusement. Everywhere, goods revealed their tyranny. A chair was a throne for mediocrity, a hat a crown for insecurity, a frock a veil for uncertainty. Possessions filled the silence where confidence should have spoken. They were props in a play called Respectability, performed daily to an audience of neighbors, each fearing laughter more than poverty. And laughter was the only honest reply. We returned home to our boots, which carried no pretensions, our umbrella, which boasted only weather, and our hat, which sat heavily but never lied. Among modest possessions we felt curiously rich. For society may continue to drape itself in goods, polish its furniture, parade its hats, and tick its clocks with stern insistence. We will continue to watch, smiling, for beneath the absurdity lies the eternal human wish to be secure, admired, and unafraid. Perhaps the only true possession is laughter, which costs nothing, suits every occasion, and never changes with fashion. The day began without a beginning. The clock on the mantelpiece ran sideways. The cat announced that it was already yesterday, and the boots danced into the street before anyone thought of wearing them. The umbrella clattered after them, opening and closing like a mouth that could not decide whether to speak or sing. The hat remained where it was, pretending indifference, though later we discovered it had gone on an entirely separate journey without informing us. We followed the boots, because one must always follow boots. They led us through the square, which had become an aquarium during the night. Fish drifted about in the air as naturally as pigeons, and shopkeepers conducted their business underwater, though no water was visible. The grocer arranged sardines in pyramids, while live sardines circled approvingly above his head. A lady carried a basket full of trout that wriggled politely, waiting to be cooked. The fountain in the center, instead of spraying buttons as before, released shoals of minnows who sang choruses about thrift. We waded onward through the invisible sea, and the umbrella snapped at a passing eel that looked impertinent. A brass band floated past, playing without instruments. Notes bubbled from their mouths and rose like balloons into the sky, where they burst into applause. Children tried to catch them, stuffing their pockets with melody. The conductor waved an invisible baton that doubled as a fishing rod, pulling down treble clefs like mackerel. The boots kept time, the umbrella tapped the rhythm, and we, unwilling but delighted, joined the parade until it dissolved into a shoal of violins. At the corner, we encountered a policeman whose helmet had turned into a beehive. Bees hummed regulations around his ears, and he translated them into gestures of authority. He accused us of jaywalking in the future, fined us for offenses we had not yet committed, and pardoned us for crimes we would probably consider later. We saluted gravely, and he rewarded us with a jar of honey labeled civic responsibility. The umbrella carried it with the dignity of evidence. Further on, the tailor had given up clothes and taken to bottling breezes. Shelves were filled with jars containing draughts from attics, sighs from staircases, and gusts from railway platforms. He insisted each had its medicinal use. A jar of crosswinds cured indecision, a flask of gales promoted eloquence, and a vial of zephyrs guaranteed popularity in drawing rooms. Customers queued patiently, carrying away invisible garments of air. We purchased a modest puff of wind that promised to improve our posture. It escaped immediately, straightening a lamppost and leaving us slouched as before. The absurdities gathered pace. In the marketplace, vegetables held elections. Cabbages argued for tradition, carrots promised reform, and turnips declared themselves above politics. Radishes distributed pamphlets, onions wept theatrically for sympathy, and potatoes organized a silent majority underground. The crowd applauded whichever vegetable happened to be speaking, and at the end everyone went home confident that their dinner would be represented in Parliament. The boots voted for cucumbers, the umbrella supported spinach, and we abstained, for neutrality seemed the safest condiment. A tram arrived that refused to stay on rails. It wandered down alleys, entered houses uninvited, and paused in gardens to let roses embark. Its conductor wore a uniform sewn from tickets, each pocket validating a different destination. We climbed aboard and found ourselves seated next to a family of clocks traveling for their holidays. The grandfather clock carried a suitcase full of chimes, the alarm clock fidgeted impatiently, and the cuckoo clock popped in and out of conversation at inconvenient intervals. Their destination was Eternity Junction, where time was said to run in circles for relaxation. The tram dropped us at a library that had lost its books but kept its index. Readers wandered through drawers of cards, reciting titles to one another, reconstructing entire volumes from memory. A man declaimed the plot of a novel without once mentioning a character's name. A lady recited recipes for puddings she had never tasted. A boy read aloud footnotes until they became poetry. The librarian, who wore spectacles without lenses, assured us that imagination was a more reliable binding than cloth. We nodded, though the umbrella muttered that a proper story should have a handle. When we left, the hat reappeared, though not on my head. It was riding a horse that turned into a piano every few steps. At one moment the animal trotted, at the next it struck chords with its hooves. The hat sat in triumph, declaring itself conductor of the cavalry. We saluted respectfully, though the boots whispered that hats should not command orchestras without a license. The horse, piano galloped away, neighing in octaves. By evening, the city had inverted itself. Streets ran vertically, houses hung from rooftops, and carriages drove across the sky. We were obliged to walk upside down, which the boots resented, though they managed it with stubborn competence. Shop windows displayed goods upon the ceilings, and customers clung to chandeliers while considering their purchases. We entered a cafe where tables were bolted overhead and coffee dripped politely into our cups from above. The umbrella complained of vertigo and opened downward to steady itself. Night brought no rest. The stars were auctioned off one by one to the highest bidder. Wealthy gentlemen bought constellations, ladies acquired necklaces of meteors, and children scrambled for shooting stars. We bid modestly and obtained a small planet rumored to influence digestion. The auctioneer assured us it came with a guarantee of eclipses. We carried it home in a paper bag, though it leaked moonlight onto the pavement. The next morning absurdity had multiplied beyond counting. Letters arrived without envelopes, carrying messages not yet written. Chairs paraded in protest against sitting, demanding recognition as works of art. Dogs walked people on leashes of philosophy. Chimneys smoked perfumes instead of soot. The marketplace sold rumors by the pound, gossip by the ounce, and scandal in convenient parcels. Everyone purchased eagerly, and by noon the air was heavy with speculation. We attempted to escape by boarding a ship, but the ship refused water and insisted on sailing across fields. Its sails were stitched from tablecloths, and its cargo consisted of teaspoons determined to colonize the world. The captain carried a compass that pointed only to applause. We voyaged through meadows where cows rang dinner bells and geese conducted debates about gravity. The ship's crew sang sea shanties about picnics. Eventually we disembarked at a station disguised as an orchard, where trains grew on branches and whistled when ripe. The climax of absurdity arrived when the entire town decided to transform into catalogs. Houses folded into pages, streets became margins, and inhabitants turned into illustrations with captions. The grocer posed beside a pyramid of virtue, the tailor demonstrated breezes in bottles, the jeweler displayed a necklace of excuses, and the policeman buzzed with bees in footnotes. We too were sketched, the umbrella sternly upright, the boots faithfully beneath, and the hat tilted with inappropriate majesty. The caption read, "Ordinary people, suitable for all occasions." We blushed, though the drawing captured us better than truth ever could. At last the absurdities grew tired of themselves and retired quietly into corners. The aquarium square evaporated, the vegetable parliament adjourned, the tram returned to its rails, and the stars resumed their posts. We walked home through streets that pretended to be sensible. The boots marched gravely, the umbrella swung with false modesty, and the hat resumed its perch with feigned innocence. Yet we knew the absurdities were only resting, ready to burst forth again at the smallest invitation. For in this life, sense is the brief interlude, and nonsense the reigning monarch. One cannot resist it, only applaud its performance. And so we applauded, quietly, as we closed the door, certain that tomorrow would arrive already ridiculous. The town declared itself a stage one morning without consulting anyone. Curtains of cloud parted, pavements rolled themselves like carpets, and lampposts leaned obligingly as footlights. We discovered ourselves in the center, with the boots polished for performance, the umbrella erect with authority, and the hat bowed as though acknowledging applause it had not yet received. Citizens gathered as audience, applauding not what we did, but what they imagined we might do. The orchestra was composed of kettles, each whistling its own part, until the whole resembled both Wagner and breakfast. The first act was a procession of mirrors. They advanced in solemn file, reflecting everything except ourselves. Instead, they displayed the versions of us we had refused to become: bankers with cautious lips, generals with extravagant boots, poets with melancholy umbrellas, and explorers with hats that doubled as compasses. The crowd gasped, and we bowed to our alternatives, relieved we were not required to live them. The hat tilted gravely, as though it had once considered leading us into those destinies, but decided against the bother. Then came the animals, though none resembled their ordinary kind. Lions padded on paws made of cushions, roaring politely at intervals. Elephants appeared with trunks designed as vacuum cleaners, hoovering up discarded programs from the street. A chorus of sheep entered in academic gowns, reciting catalogs in Latin. The umbrella saluted them with a flourish, for sheep in gowns deserve courtesy. The boots tapped nervously, for cushioned lions tread heavily even when polite. The second act was announced by a cannon that fired hats into the sky. They floated like balloons before settling on heads that did not suit them. A solemn vicar found himself beneath a jester's cap, while a child staggered under the weight of a bishop's mitre. A policeman's beehive helmet was replaced by a bonnet trimmed with cherries, which the bees accepted cheerfully. The audience roared with laughter, and for a moment the entire hierarchy of society wobbled upon unfamiliar brims. The hat upon my head remained secure, smug in its certainty that it could never be replaced. A chorus line of furniture danced next, tables stepping with heavy grace, chairs leaping acrobatically, and a sofa executing a surprisingly nimble pirouette. Drawers opened in rhythm, spilling socks that twirled like ribbons. The crowd clapped time, and the boots joined in, stamping with such vigor they nearly wore out their souls. The umbrella attempted a waltz, but became entangled with a rocking chair, and together they performed a duet of comic misfortune. The stage manager, a grandfather clock with impeccable manners, brought them to order with a strike of midnight. The climax of the spectacle was a parade of days. Monday entered stiffly, armed with ledgers. Tuesday followed, yawning with inattention. Wednesday strutted, Thursday limped, Friday jingled coins. Saturday wore its trousers scandalously short, and Sunday floated solemnly in ecclesiastical robes. Each day presented its grievances to the audience, who listened with the sympathy due to weather forecasts. We cheered Saturday most loudly, though the hat frowned, preferring the dignity of Thursday. As if to exceed itself, the town summoned the seasons to march. Spring advanced on a float of blossom, scattering confetti of petals into open mouths. Summer rode in a carriage drawn by bees, tossing out handfuls of strawberries. Autumn swept the streets with a broom of bronze leaves, muttering that it would never be appreciated. Winter arrived on a sleigh pulled by sighs, distributing icicles as souvenirs. The crowd applauded until their hands reddened, for it is not every day one sees time arranged as entertainment. The boots carried us into the center of the finale. Unwilling heroes drafted without rehearsal. A platform rose beneath us, decorated with catalog illustrations pasted in random order, umbrellas sheltering elephants, boots worn by mountains, hats balanced upon steeples, and chairs presiding over parliaments. The orchestra of kettles shrieked magnificently, the mirrors spun until they fractured into sparks, and the animals bowed in unison. A trumpet announced that we were to deliver the moral of the performance, though no one had provided us with a script. The umbrella cleared its throat and proclaimed that weather was destiny, that those who carried umbrellas ruled over those who forgot them. The boots contradicted it, insisting that true authority belonged to souls that wore out streets. The hat interrupted both, declaring with unshakable gravity that no head was complete without adornment. The audience cheered each proclamation, uncertain which to accept but unwilling to deny any. We stood between them, smiling vaguely, which the crowd mistook for wisdom. Fireworks erupted in the shape of catalog entries. Rockets burst into teapots, Roman candles blossomed as waistcoats, Catherine wheels spun into parasols, and fountains of sparks cascaded into staircases. The sky became a department store ceiling, glittering with bargains too bright to touch. Children gasped, adults nodded gravely, and the animals clapped their paws. It seemed the entire world had agreed to parody itself for one magnificent hour. As the spectacle drew toward its conclusion, the stars themselves joined in. They rearranged into advertisements. Orion declared himself suitable for evening wear. The Great Bear announced discounts on honey. Cassiopeia offered celestial upholstery, guaranteed to outlast dynasties. Even the moon hung a banner across its face, proclaiming what a life in letters visible for miles. The crowd fell to its knees, not in reverence but in shopping instinct. The sky had become the ultimate window display. At last, the curtains of cloud closed, the lampposts straightened, and the pavements unrolled into ordinary streets. Citizens dispersed, returning to their homes with programs folded into paper hats. The animals departed politely. The mirrors stacked themselves into storage, and the kettles sighed back into kitchens. We were left standing in the square, the boots dusty from performance, the umbrella bent with excitement, and the hat smug as a monarch who has survived revolution. We returned home uncertain whether we had witnessed theater or truth. Yet the walls trembled with suppressed laughter, the chairs winked knowingly, and the clock ticked in triple time as though applauding the absurdity. The boots collapsed in a heap, exhausted by their unexpected starring role. The umbrella leaned proudly against the wall, rehearsing its speech for tomorrow. The hat descended from my head with a bow, then perched itself on the mantelpiece like a trophy. That night we dreamed not of peace but of encore. Streets turning again into stages, animals roaring politely, days and seasons bowing in sequence, and the stars spelling out bargains for eternity. We woke laughing, and the laughter refused to stop, echoing through the morning like the only possible commentary. For if life insists on parody, the least we can do is applaud. The conclusion announced itself as though it had been waiting impatiently in the wings, while all the earlier acts stumbled and glittered. We woke one morning to find the street had become circular, looping upon itself with the determination of a snake chasing its own tail. We walked forward only to meet ourselves coming back, surprised at how little we had changed. The boots complained that progress was impossible. The umbrella insisted that circles were simply straight lines with ambition, and the hat declared the arrangement entirely natural, since crowns had been round since time began. Shops joined the conspiracy. The grocer sold turnips labeled as philosophical arguments, the tailor offered suits cut exclusively for imaginary friends, and the chemist bottled silence in tonic form. We purchased a jar of quiet only to discover it buzzed furiously when opened. The stationer, not to be outdone, sold us a pencil guaranteed to write conclusions. It broke at once, which seemed an accurate summary. The town council assembled on stilts, claiming that elevation improved decision-making. Their resolutions were shouted down at birds who mistook them for gossip. The mayor's chair collapsed into laughter, the minutes of the meeting danced away, and the public applauded the farce as though it were intended. Society seemed determined to finish not with order, but with a bow to nonsense. Meanwhile the clocks staged a strike. Midnight refused to arrive, noon overslept, and breakfast stretched endlessly into a parody of eternity. People attempted to continue regardless, but conversations became trapped in greetings, meals hovered forever at first courses, and music never advanced beyond its opening bars. The boots, impatient, tried to stamp time back into order, but only succeeded in scuffing the floor. The umbrella tried to shade us from timelessness, while the hat sat heavier than ever, as if to remind us that even weight might be illusory. The animals returned for a final bow. Lions roared lullabies, elephants juggled teaspoons, and parrots recited parliamentary debates. Sheep in gowns voted to adjourn existence altogether, while cats performed solemn ceremonies for the dignity of windowsills. The crowd cheered. The orchestra of kettles whistled in crescendo, and the entire town dissolved into applause directed at itself. At this moment the catalogue pages began fluttering down from the sky. Each page carried an image without explanation, a chair shaking hands with a volcano, an umbrella balancing on a loaf of bread, a boot preaching sermons to bewildered fishes, a hat floating alone upon a sea of teaspoons. We gathered them like confetti, unable to assemble them into sense yet unwilling to discard them. Children made paper boats of the illustrations, which promptly sailed into the gutters toward destiny. Adults folded them into hats and declared themselves wiser. Then came the most peculiar incident. A mirror, taller than any house, walked into the square and asked politely what we had learned. We stared into it and saw ourselves carrying boots, umbrella, and hat, looking simultaneously serious and ridiculous. The mirror nodded as though satisfied, then turned around to reveal nothing at all on its reverse. With that, it strolled away and disappeared into the crowd of days. The finale refused grandeur. Instead, every object in town began to laugh. Chairs chuckled from corners, tables giggled into tablecloths, teapots whistled mirth, and clocks ticked with mischievous delight. The pavements rumbled with suppressed laughter. The chimneys wheezed amusement, and even the lampposts leaned conspiratorially. It was contagious. Soon the citizens joined in, laughing until they forgot whether they had reason. The boots laughed with their laces, the umbrella laughed through its ribs, and the hat laughed in muffled dignity. We, helpless, laughed too, until the street itself seemed in danger of shaking apart. At last the laughter ebbed into silence, the sort of silence that pretends to be sensible. People straightened their collars, chairs resumed their posture, and kettles returned to kitchens. Yet every face carried a grin it could not quite hide, and every object winked when no one was looking. The town had performed its last act, not with a curtain, but with a shrug. We returned home, where nothing was in its place, yet everything felt familiar. The boots lay quietly by the door, scuffed but loyal. The umbrella leaned against the wall, a little bent, but proud of its speeches. The hat settled on the mantelpiece, content with its reign of absurd authority. We sat among them, waiting for the next outburst of nonsense, but none came. Instead, there was only the ticking of a clock that had forgotten its quarrel with time, and the faint rustle of catalog pages rearranging themselves into memory. And so the story ended not with a conclusion, but with a continuation disguised as rest. Life, after all, is never serious in the way one expects. It is a series of illustrations shuffled into improbable order, a parade of objects insisting on character, a catalog that refuses to stay on its shelf. To demand sense is to miss the joke, to laugh is to join the company. We looked at one another and said what everyone always says when absurdity has had the last word. What a life. Then we laughed again, because the words sounded final, though they promised nothing but repetition. The boots stretched, the umbrella sighed, the hat tilted knowingly, and we understood that tomorrow would be another catalog, another comedy, another chance to mistake nonsense for destiny and to applaud it anyway.